Ascent Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Startup Story, An Entrepreneur's Journey from Idea to Exit by Martin Warner, narrated by Jonathan Cowley. Preface. I hate turbulence. Who wants to fly through chaotic air currents where, despite the pilot's best efforts, the plane is plunging and soaring like you're riding a roller coaster? I was born in England, but I live in the United States, and I often fly across the Atlantic. But I reckon that if you want to be flung up and down in your seat, you ought to be riding bareback at the rodeo. I dream of a smooth linear trajectory cruising at speed through the atmosphere without resistance, irresistible and fancy-free, and of course all electric. But that is another story. It's funny how, even back on the ground, that so rarely happens. But somehow you still have to work out how to get to your destination in one piece without crashing. And I've been helping would-be entrepreneurs do this for the last 2 decades. In a way, I guess you could sum it all up in the 2 words my old father would come out with when he was teaching me to drive, and specifically, how not to crunch the gears on an old manual car. Be smooth. It's funny how the path is rarely as smooth as you might like it to be. They say that those who can do, those who can't teach. But I wouldn't teach business unless I thought I could do it. I had already been running my classes and training programs for more than 10 years when the following story starts. One thing I discovered is that theory is one thing, and practice very often is another, which explains why this is a deconstructed reconstruction, a schizoid memoir, with my own experience straying a long way from the impersonal, omniscient musings of my more pedagogical self, aka the professor, author of EntrepreneurSeminar.com and The Entrepreneur's Book of Secrets. The professor doesn't have to worry about turbulence. He gets to see everything from on high, from a great distance, almost like he's standing on the moon and looking down on the earth through a telescope. Whereas I, in contrast, the entrepreneur in the field, having left the classroom behind, am trying to swim through a tsunami, and floating trees and assorted debris are smashing into me all the time, and I'm just trying to hang on and keep my head above water. The professor is more cool, cosmic, and all-seeing. I am more on the verge of a nervous breakdown. He undoubtedly speaks with an English accent, a little like the Obi-Wan Kenobi of business ethics, with a lot of acronyms and checklists, whereas I curse and rant a lot more and sound as though I come from and still live on the mean streets of New York or New Jersey. Maybe we're both extremists, but stick us on the same page and you might have something like a balanced equation. I'm still teaching, so I'm the first to admit that the history of bot objects is anything but a how-to manual. If anything, it's more a how not to. It ignores the professor at nearly every turn. It's a risky experiment that takes place in the real world with dramatic consequences. But my startup story might stand as a user's guide to making it through and finding the pot of gold at the end of a 3D rainbow, despite all the turbulence, beset by mishaps, missteps, bad ideas, bad actors, and near failure, even through dark clouds of fear and anxiety. Sometimes you just have to throw caution to those godforsaken winds, take a deep breath, and fly by the seat of your pants. And finally, if the price is right, parachute out. Some names have been changed to protect individual privacy, you know who you are, and to give me a decent shot at not being sued. 1. The Pink Whistle, in which we get straight down to business. I was mulling over the mysteries of colour. People who are colourblind are basically right. There is no such thing as colour. Humans invented the rainbow, Ask yourself, what color are raindrops? Our brains are normally wired to generate the effect of color out of random electromagnetic signals. All I needed to do, I realized, was reverse engineer the human brain. How hard could it be? And then Tom O'Brien knocked on my door with a pink whistle in his hand. At the time, I was living in a farmhouse in Kent in the south of England. It was one evening early in 2013, around 8 o'clock. Tom is only a few years younger than me, and now he has grown a beard and spiky hair and looks like a proper grown-up. But back then he still looked like a fresh-faced boy to me, a particularly geeky kid. Call him a technologist and an engineer, or mad inventor, if you will, who had been spending too much time locked away in his bedroom doing his homework, glued to his computer, or running weird experiments. Whatever he had been up to, young Frankenstein had driven a couple of 100 miles south from Nottingham to come and tell me about it. "Hey, Em, I brought you something," he said, handing me the whistle. He liked to call me M because it made him feel like James Bond, or more likely Q, his techie sidekick. We went into the kitchen so I could have a proper look at it in the light. "It's a whistle," I said. "Pink." "Translucent electric magenta," he said. "Pink," I said. "With extra glitter. See the metallic particles?" I poured us both a glass of wine, but I put down my glass and picked up the whistle and put it to my lips and blew. I was expecting a short, sharp note, like the sound of a football referee signaling the start of a game, but it was more like a mini siren. It had a paddle inside it with slats like a watermill that kept the sound rolling. "It works all right," I said, "but I can feel the surface is a bit rough. It needs smoothing down." "You made this, didn't you? Did you make it using a 3D printer?" He grinned. "I'm going to do a recorder next," he said. "Then the full orchestra." Back then, personal 3D printers barely existed in the wider world. They were experimental. In a way, you could say that nearly all manufacturing machines are making something in 3D, if it's not a 2D drawing. But the quintessential 3D printer, conjuring up something or anything out of superimposed layers of a malleable substance, according to what instructions you fed in, was typically huge, the size of a mainframe computer. You could produce actual three-dimensional objects out of a printer, but only if you had a factory or an industrial design facility. DIY fanatic that he is, Tom had built the 3D printer himself in his garage in a couple of weeks over Christmas, filching the software from open-source materials. "You built your own 3D printer? Why didn't you tell me?" I said. "All you need is a good nozzle," he said modestly, "and a few bits and bobs." Demonstrably, Tom's invention worked. It was a Frankenstein's monster that could produce new objects. When Tom hit me with the pink, "OK, translucent electric magenta whistle," I had a bundle of other ideas going around in my head. We had already worked on a number of different projects together, and we were supposed to be talking about a recruitment website and video interviewing. But probably because of my experience in producing and scripting and platforming films, I had also been thinking about different techniques for defining and generating full color. But until that point, I had been looking for answers in the camera. Now I thought I could see the full color spectrum coming out of a nozzle. That was where it all started for me. Don't put it on the screen, make it real. This idea blew all other thoughts out of my head. So I turned the pink whistle around in my hand and considered the possibilities. "Can you do full color?" "No," he said. "This was simply the color of the original filament I fed into the printer to produce the desired object at the other end." He took off his backpack and reached in and came up with 2 reels of filament of different colors. They looked like spaghetti. "I can do you blue, and I can do you yellow." "Do you mind if I chop off a bit of these?" I said. I already had my Stanley knife out and sliced off a short length of each filament on the cutting board. Then I tossed both blue and yellow, like pieces of pasta, in a frying pan and lit the burner. "You're going to kill your frying pan," Tom said. "It'll be worth it," I said, "if it works." I turned up the heat another notch. Soon the two filaments started melting, and as they melted, so they merged with one another, the blue and the yellow pools pushing up against one another. I gave them a helping hand with a wooden spatula, shoving them around in the pan, impatient for them to cook. The smell wasn't too delicious, but my little kitchen concoction was starting to thicken up and bind like a plastic omelette. Green! Tom was impressed and reassured. "Shows it can be done," I said. I didn't really know until I tried it. I mean, I know it works with light and paint, but I never tried it with plastic before. It was, in its very preliminary, malodorous way, a proof of concept. Ever since I was a kid, I've been involved in reams of schemes and businesses of all kinds, and I was right then in the midst of steering a couple of different companies. Even so, the fact is you're always on the lookout for the next big idea to come along. I noticed that the professor devotes a whole seminar module to pontificating on how to find the best business opportunities. But sometimes you don't have to find the best opportunities. They find you. You just have to be ready. I guess this is what the professor means when he says, "For so many reasons, we need open-mindedness." And just at that moment, the gooey, gunky gloop sitting in my frying pan on the burner in my kitchen looked to me like a glimpse of the future, even though the pan itself never recovered, and my dear American wife said I was an idiot. 2. Two guys in the bath. Branding. Actually, it wasn't a bath. It was, strictly speaking, a hot tub or spa or jacuzzi. But I guess that counts as a very big bath with a lot of bubbles. The hot tub was in my back garden behind the garage, with a view over the hills in the distance. Since it was dark, you could only see a shadowy outline of woodland and the starry firmament above beaming down on us. The only terrestrial lights were the ones on in the house and the strip of waterproof LED lights around the edge of the tub. That, and the glow that came from two mid-strength Cohiba Robusta cigars, which we had lit up on our way outside. But maybe darkness was good for the vision, because Tom and I were seeing what could be, dreaming a concept into existence, while the bath bubbled away and we half floated, weightless in the water, contemplating a whole new realm that had just opened up, and sipping champagne. We felt we were at the beginning of something huge. It seemed to us then, as we gazed up at the universe, surfing a wave of Havana-infused bubbles, that our 3D printer could be the next PC, as big as Microsoft or Apple. From the very beginning, we knew I was going to be CEO, Tom was CTO, Chief Technology Officer. He was a Steve Wozniak, the techie guy who would make it real, recruit the engineers and the manufacturer who could build it, and develop the website too. All I had to do was sell it to the world. But first of all, we had to work out what it was exactly. "We need a name for it," I said. Well, it's got to sound serious, professional. So let's call it Pro something, like the MacBook Pro. Makes sense. You don't want amateur in the name. It's got to be a desktop machine, obviously. "But it doesn't fit on a desktop," said Tom nervously. "It barely fits into my garage." "Okay," I said, "but it has to fit on a desktop in the home, otherwise it's not going to sell to the masses. So put desktop in the name. And it's a 3D printer. So that's easy. Pro Desktop 3D. Or shorten it to Pro Desk 3D. How does that sound? Who's ProDesk 3D? What are we doing? Who is we exactly? Tom was always asking the awkward questions. We came up with the name of the company right there, sitting in the tub. It was obvious, really. Everyone was talking about bots in those days because they wanted to be in on robotics. And weren't we making objects? We bounced it to and fro. We both liked the sound of bot objects. We could worry about the small detail of hiring a crew further down the road. Within about 5 or 10 minutes of getting into the bath, we had come up with a name for the company and the product. I felt as though it already existed, even if purely at the level of imagination. We had started our startup right then and there in the hot tub. I had this insane feeling, which owed something to the galaxies wheeling over our heads, that it was already written in the stars. We went on sitting there for the next hour or 90 minutes. It's important to maintain a sense of realism. So says the professor in Lesson 1. Maybe so, but a strong dose of madness, sky-high optimism, and a couple of Cuban cigars probably help too. The key thing is it has to be full color, I said. But 3D can't do full color, said Tom. Not yet. That's why ours has to do full color. It's our USP. I was recalling secret number 32 from the Entrepreneur's Book of Secrets. Find your USP, unique selling point. We had found it, hadn't we? Let me know how you're going to do that, won't you? Trust Tom to quibble. He had this weird habit of worrying about practicalities. Look at the world. That's full color. Just copy that. It turned out that one of the first things Tom had printed was a model car, balloon-powered, for his 3-year-old son. He had done it in red. The kid was knocked out by it, but his response was, "Thanks, Dad. Can you do me one in blue, please? I prefer blue. Blue is my favorite color." After an initial parental gasp of frustration and contemplating his monochromatic creation, Tom had asked himself, why can't I do blue or green or purple or any other color I fancy at any time? If a 2D printer can do it, why not a 3D printer? I let out a great cloud of highly scented Havana-style smoke. We could worry about the details later. And it has to look good too, I said. It has to be a work of art. Tasteful, classy, comparable with Apple at least, or Rolex, or Nike Air. People have to want to own one. I want people keeping one in the box and selling it a few years later for 10 times the price. We weren't the only 3D guys out there. Not that we were out there, not at all, but you have to think ahead. So our hypothetical machine had to stand out. It had to be the most functional machine, but it had to have a beautiful form too. It had to be a Lamborghini or a Ferrari among 3D printers. Was that too much to ask? When I thought about 3D printers, I realized one thing. We were at the beginning of the movement. People were just beginning to get excited about them. If you think of technology adoption in terms of a sine curve or a wave, we were well past the phase of initial skepticism, and we were fast approaching the peak. And, of course, were far away from contemplating any potential downside or wipeout. Everybody wanted to know more, to see if it was real. Now that I had seen and blown the pink whistle, I was a believer. Others would follow. All we needed to do was get on the ramp. How thick are your layers? I asked. I knew that 3D printers worked using fused deposition modeling, FDM for short. In other words, they build up the object using thin layers of plastic from the bottom up, one on top of another, like sheets of phyllo pastry, hence the phrase additive manufacturing. Obviously, if you want a really fine finish, the thinner the layer, the better. The reason the pink whistle was so rough to the touch was that Tom had set up his machine to use relatively thick layers, around 100 microns, which produced ridges. The industry minimum at that time, so far as I knew, was around 50 microns. Can we get it down to 25 microns? 25? We can do that, but it's hard. A quantum leap down from 100 or even 50. You want to make a violin or a cheese grater? A violin? Or even a golf club, I said. It has to be smooth. It has to be streamlined. Nobody buys clunky. It's slower at 25. So let's speed it up. Lying there in the hot tub, borne up on a tide of bubbles like we were inside a giant bottle of champagne, we were convinced that there had to be a market for a fully functioning machine that did for 3D printing what Apple had done for mobile phones. Our machine would be different. Ours would be unique, the next generation. I scattered superlatives around like confetti. So much for realism. Sometimes realism sounds like a synonym for doing nothing. We were visionaries. Our brains were racing way ahead of reality. We both had the attitude that anything is possible. We had already cracked open a bottle and smoked the cigars. We were committed. Maybe we should have been committed to an asylum, but so far all we had was a whistle. 3. Fly fishing. Deep background. Flying to New York, my head in the clouds, I had Tom on the seat next to me. One thing you have to know about Tom. This is the guy who holds the UK record for fly casting. How far you can cast your fly in fly fishing. He even made and started selling his own flies at the age of 11. He could build his own computers and code his own games by the age of 13. He dropped out of university after a year because he realized he already knew everything they were teaching him. He made a small fortune making and selling his brand of MP3 players before the advent of the iPod wiped him out. If he could do all that, he could surely conjure up the world's best domestic 3D printer, couldn't he? I got my start in business at the age of 11, finding my first customers in the school playground and renting out games for the Atari console at £1 a night. Our headmaster, who didn't fully understand entrepreneurship, soon put a stop to that. Having confiscated my games, he then handed them over to his own kids. I paid him back one day when I took his cane and snapped it in two. Next, it was cowboy belts. They were very popular at the time. I first came across them selling for £4 on a market stall in my hometown in Kent. You couldn't buy one in the shops for less than £15. I told my dad I want to buy up the whole stall. He was my angel investor. He funded 100 belts. I sold them around local schools at £6.50 a time. I added on the 50 pence because it made it sound like more of a bargain. A profit of over 50%. After that, they started calling me Arthur Daly in the playground, the shrewd but slightly dodgy second-hand car salesman, all-round wheeler-dealer and protagonist of Minder, a popular British TV series of the 1980s. I was still only 12. My other nickname growing up was Rain Man on account of my moody obsessiveness. My mother used to say that I was autistic. I didn't really know what she meant by that. I took the Myers-Briggs personality test about 5 times, and for a while I thought I must be schizophrenic. It was only many years later that I was diagnosed as having a hyperactive brain, which sounds cool, and many people say to me, I wish I had a hyperactive brain. The reality is it's okay if you don't mind being awake at all hours of the night stewing over your latest scheme. I guess it's ideal if you're an entrepreneur or a chess player. Fun fact, even now my wife says to people, don't worry, he's a little bit autistic, when I think I'm being as witty as hell. To be honest, with my social skills, it's amazing I even have a wife. I learned chess around the age of 5 and dreamed of becoming the next Bobby Fischer. I never made Grand Master, but I think that's because I got distracted by the great and complex chess game that is business. When I was a teenager, I naturally wanted to go to the Michael Jackson and Madonna gigs in London, the Bad Tour and Who's That Girl. I was amazed by how expensive the tickets were, but I was even more fascinated by the price variation. You could find cheaper ones if you knew how. Back then there was no online option, so I just queued up. I bought tickets in bulk, using my profits from my cowboy belts, held on to them, then sold them for double or triple nearer to the event. I started out in Soho, and within a couple of years I had built up a network of a couple of hundred ticket brokers, aka touts. They got their cut, but I made a small fortune. Growing up, I was always a fan of Clint Eastwood in Rawhide. After that, it was spaghetti westerns. Hooked on the silver screen, I had a notion of becoming an actor and went as far as studying acting in New York, but I didn't really have the talent to pretend to be someone other than who I am. But still, I've always been a bit of a restless, rootless cowboy at heart, which might help to explain how one day a few years back, I found myself at La Défense in Paris, 50 or 60 stories up, standing on top of an AC unit with my nose pressed against the window and staring down at the world far below. I had been working for a well-known investment bank, which, for the sake of argument, let's call P.J. Rogan, for almost a decade. I was like a gambler who had been given his dream job working in a casino. I started off as a trader, and I ended up designing risk metric software that would do automatic trading and was far better at it than I ever was. I had turned IT management into a business, which we called Titan, to be distinguished from the Titanic, and was in Paris to finalize a deal with IBM. I want to emphasize one thing. I wasn't about to jump. I'm not sure it was even physically possible to jump. Perhaps for fear that P.J. Rogan employees are particularly liable to jump in the event of a crash or a crisis, the windows in our building didn't easily open. I would probably have needed to smash my way out with a sledgehammer. But that was not my purpose in any case. If you've seen anyone jump out of a window, you're less liable to jump yourself, I reckon. On the other hand, I did have this strange out-of-body sensation of floating out through the window and looking down from above on the insect-sized people far below. What was I doing with my life? Where did I think I was going? I was, after all, one of tens of thousands working for P.J. Rogan. I was bringing in deals so big they couldn't afford to sack me. So far so good, you might say, as the guy hurtling down past the fifth-story window is supposed to say. But wasn't it also true, I thought to myself as I hovered out over the Place de la Défense, that all we were ultimately doing was making more money for P.J. Rogan? So was that all I was, a money-making machine? Is that all my life is good for, multiplying money? And what is worse, for someone else? Am I the parasite? Or are they? I've always had a sneaking admiration for people like Jordan Belfort, the Wolf of Wall Street, who can conjure up vast sums of money, and even for those like the rogue trader Nick Gleason, who can cause equally astronomical sums to disappear. Either way, there is something magical about it. But in that moment of enlightenment and pseudo-levitation in Paris, I realized one thing. It wasn't about the money for me, or not anymore it wasn't. I was tired of investment banking. Did any of it really matter? I had become a glorified software salesman, a helicommuter schmoozing corporate clients at Wimbledon and Le Mans. But my Wall Street dream was over. I needed to transcend my former self to get out and create. I needed to build. I needed to make something. It almost didn't matter what. Maybe it was appropriate.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?